We are talking about controls in information systems, and we will very quickly review couple of transparencies just for continuity. The primary objectives of controls is to make sure the data entering the computer, they are all correct, because as you know, any incorrect data is going to give incorrect results, and data entry is all clerical. So, clerical handling of data before it is put in the input to the computer has to be properly organized and checked, and this is a very important part, particularly when you are starting a new project. For instance, the Karnataka government is now trying to computerize what they call the urban land records, particularly the ownership of certain piece of land for the last 15 or 16 years for legal purposes. In other words, as the land is free of debt, they call it incumbents and so on. So far it has been done all manually. Now, when they want to go to the computer, then they have to enter all this data clerically. Somebody has to sit down and look at all those registers and enter it. So, unless you organize the clerical entering of data carefully, so that no errors are made in the entry, later on any processing you do and give legal documents to a owner saying that there is no debt on that, or a prospective purchaser, there will be legal complications. So, you have to be extremely careful about the clerical handling of data, and you have to do a lot of cross checking, and it is not a very simple affair. Also, there should be means of detecting and tracing errors which occur due to bad data entry or bad programs. In other words, you have to find out whether the errors in after computing, you find some errors. The errors may be either due to bad data entry or maybe due to bad program. You got to be able to isolate, and so one of the objectives of control is to be able to isolate, and detecting and tracing errors also requires some method of making sure that before the data is actually entered, there is some cross checking which takes place. And in the case of land records, for instance, always a responsible person who is an official of the government has to authenticate every entry by a signature to say that the entry is correct, and this will hold the person responsible. So, this is called an audit trail. That is, in other words, there is a signature which says that this person has done it. Okay? And so, if he has been careless, he can be taken to task. So, ensure legal requirements are met. I said, if there is an incorrect data entry and later on it leads to a legal complication, this signature is an important part of any legal matters which may come up later, and to guard against frauds, because when somebody enters data, particularly valuable data like records of holdings of lands, if intentionally frauds are made, then one has to be able to guard against it. In other words, make sure that frauds do not occur before they occur. In fact, you should not let frauds occur at all. This is particularly true about financial data, particularly banks and so on, financial data, where they handle lakhs and lakhs of rupees. There are always room for fraud, and one has to be extremely wary about making sure that controls are there so that frauds are detected. It is even true about marks of students in examinations which are being entered. If there is a fraud by a clerk, entry clerk, that has to be guarded against by appropriate controls. In other words, you should make sure that a fraud, if at all it occurs, is detected early. So, you must have some way of doing it. I will tell you how it is done, particularly for exam paper marks and things like that. So, there are many measures, including organizational measures. There is well defined responsibility for input preparation, delivery, output use, operation and maintenance. That is, each person who does a part of the work is clearly his role is mentioned, and his role is restricted to that. He cannot overstep whatever he has been told to do, and that is important as a part of control. And changes, if any, made to a program has to be documented, and who made the change has got to be put there either with a signature, or in fact nowadays they have biometric controls. In other words, when somebody changes and he puts a thumbprint there saying that he is the person who has changed it, and only authorized people can change it, and it should be documented. Performance of tasks of recording must be different from the performance of task and recording must be different persons to prevent faults. Let me give an example. In the case of marks, for instance, if you are trying to use a control total, that is, you take a set of marks and make the control total, okay, and if the person who makes the control total is the same person who enters the data, what he can do is to interchange two marks and the total will still remain the same. Suppose somebody got 70 marks and somebody got 17 marks. He can interchange 17 and 70 for 70 for the person whom he is favoring, and then the total control total will remain the same. So, the control total will not detect this. So, the control total has got to be made by a person other than the person who is going to do the data entry. So, the person who is doing the task of data entry must not also have the responsibility of finding out the control total. So, these two different people are there, and the control totals are kept with the third person, and when the data is processed, the totaling is done on the data and is checked against the control total to make sure that the two match, and this checking is done by a supervisor, and you have to make sure that you don't make it easy for the person to commit this kind of a thing. So, there are a number of types of controls. One is called input preparation control. Input preparation control means while preparing the input, you must make sure that some measures are taken to detect errors and also trail and find out where the errors occurred. One important thing is sequence numbering. That is, each data record entered must have a sequence number, so you can actually count the sequence numbering, and if anything is missing out of sequence, then you know it has been deleted intentionally or maybe accidentally. So, one should be able to find out missing records or duplicate records. So, this is detected by sequence numbering. Batch controls are like control totals I talked about. That is, you take a batch of 50 and total a particular field, and this totaling is done by somebody else, and when the program is actually run, this total is generated, and this total is checked against the total which the person may have, and the person who is entering should not know at what point the control total is being put. Okay. So, in other words, if he knows where the control total is being put, then still the possibility of fraud is there. So, you may randomize it. You may do it for 30 records first, you may do it for the next 40 records and so on, and at random place you can do the totaling, and then you can check it by running a program. And many places, particularly if it is financial data or even in terms of mark sheets and so on, there are situations where people do a data entry and data verification. That means somebody enters data. One way of doing this is that one person enters the data and all the data goes into a floppy, An independent person whom the first person does not know does the entire data entry also independently. That means you are duplicating the work. So, when you duplicate the work, you have to be careful, because it is going to be a lot more expensive in terms of time and cost, but some cases it is inevitable. So, that the judgment has to come from the analyst, or what are the data which are critical, where you got to do a data entry and verification. In the olden days, when punch cards are being used, there is one machine called a data entry machine, the other one called a verification machine, where data entry was done by both people. The entire data is put into the other machine, and then any incorrect entry, that card is thrown out. But now, of course, data is, when is entered, it may be stored in a floppy disk, and the other data entry operator may also enter it in a floppy disk. Then you have a program. You run both these data, both these floppy disks, which are inputs to a program or a checking program, and it will check record by record. And if there is any discrepancy between two records, it will point out the sequence number of that record where the error has occurred. Okay. Then you can go back and compare the two records and see, also with the original, to see which one is an error and correct that error. Okay. Even though it takes a little time, there is effectively an approach which is a cautious approach, where particularly if something is going into a very valuable database, you make sure that the data which is going into a permanent valuable database does not have avoidable errors. Because you may also be selective in terms of the fact that certain fields you may not duplicate, and which are not all that important, but certain fields which are important you may decide to duplicate. Okay. So, those kinds of judgments is up to the analyst. And apart from the batch totals, that is taking the a particular field and adding all that and putting a control total, in some cases you also have record totals. And record totals again, particularly things like, for instance, interchanging of 2 marks and so on, unless it is done wholesale, the entire records are interchanged, which is of course rare, but that anyhow will be detected by the control total if it is randomized. The record total records a specific field, specific fields in that record. Then here again, to guard against fraud, what you do is you need not add all the fields in a record and keep a record total. What you may do is pick random fields in the record, make the total, and that is done separately and kept by a separate person. And so the person who is entering does not know which particular fields have been added together, and it will never be the same. Maybe for different batches different record totals are kept, but record totals is a very good method of again detecting data entry errors which may occur. The errors may be accidental or it may be intentional. Either case, the recorded total will bring out which record is in error. Of course, we looked at the key. For a key field, self-checking digits are always used, and we actually looked at the modulus 11 check digit system for a set of numbers, that is for keys which are numerical. I also pointed out that the same idea can be used for alphanumeric fields by using, say, modulus 37 or modulus some prime number. In the case of if it is capital letters and digits, then the total number of characters are 10 digits and 26 alphabets, so 36. So next larger prime is 37. So its modulo 37 can be used. So these are self-checking codes, which again is a method of looking at the any errors in entry. One more thing called a proof figures, but actually this proof figure is a processing control. In other words, if normally we expect that in addition no errors are made by the computer. Normally computers do not make errors. It is only a program which can make an error or data entry which can make an error in this. Both of them will be brought out by this control. For instance, I am taking an example. If you are taking a field, a record with item code, quantity supplied and cost per unit, to this you add something called a proof cost. Proof cost is you take the highest possible cost. Okay, if suppose the cost lies between say 15 rupees and 25 rupees, you take a number which is maybe 50, which is much above this this range, and then create for each record one more field called a proof field, where you subtract from this number 50 the cost of each of those, cost per unit of each of those records, and this is called a proof cost, and you keep it as a one more field. Okay, and the way it is used is you multiply, so you add up all the quantities, okay, multiply by the proof h, the 50 in the case. Okay, that should equal the sum of quantity times proof cost, which is plus quantity times cost per unit. Okay. In other words, if these two do not equal, in other words, you can see that very clearly proof cost is h minus cost per unit, and so h minus cost per unit, sigma cost per unit will become negative and become it will be subtracted from sigma quantity cost per unit, and what will remain will be h quantity, and so the two sides should be equal. So if there is any mistake made in any of the entries, this will be brought out, and also if there is any error made in the addition process, that also will be brought out. If the two sides are not equal, there is an error. So this is again one more method of detecting errors. There is also something called a two-way check. In other words, you are in a payroll, you have gross pay, deductions and net pay. You add up all the gross pays, add up all the deductions for a group, control group, and then add up all the net pay, and these two should obviously be equal. If they do not equal, then there is some error, okay, which you can trace. Because provided you keep your batch sizes small enough, then you go back and say where the error occurred. Okay. And similarly, if they are giving rebates or percentage discount, a discount percentage times the value of the sale added together should give the total rebate total, which is or discount total, which the company has given. This again is a pure arithmetic, but then again any data entry error will again be brought out, and even processing errors will be brought out. If there is any error which is brought out in the processing, that is in terms of the way in which you wrote your program, even that will be brought out. Normally we expect that machine arithmetic will not be incorrect, but there have also been cases where when new chips are introduced, they did have in some cases obscure errors, and one had to be varied in that case. Of course, they will recall the chip later on, but then for the initial period there could be error. And the responsibility always for the data processing community to make sure that there is no errors are coming because of the errors which are made by computer. Because the public perception, if there is any error, they always blame it's a computer error. It's not a computer error normally. It is an error of the programming. It is actually human error because the program is incorrectly written, or a data entry error, which is also human. Okay. Normally errors are human, not mechanical. But we have somehow feel more satisfied to blame a machine rather than a person. Now there is one more kind of a system which is used called checkpoint. there is periodically when so particularly a long calculation which is going on, at appropriate periods you store the process state. Process state includes all the registers whose values are important and also the map of the memory, what all is contained in memory. In the case of data processing, maybe entire memory map would be a very important thing to have, because then you can resurrect. Okay, and at the checkpoint you take some controls at that point. So you periodically store all the process states and the entire memory map of the machine, and if there is any failure of the machine later on, you can roll back to that point of failure and restart again. The whole idea is that certain programs take hours together to run. Suppose after running for 2.5 hours on the computer, particularly data intensive programs, it is more apt also for scientific programs which are always take a long time, but even commercial programs, that is data processing programs, we are doing say million records of student examinations, then it is going to take a fair amount of time. Okay, even if it takes 1 minute per person, it will take fairly long amount of time. So what you have to do is, if it is a very long run, there is always a possibility of some failure. The failure could be due to some malfunction of the computer, which may be because of power fluctuation, or maybe because some disk error occurred. Okay, and there could be many reasons, particularly when you run a very long program. There is every possibility that there could be some kind of a problem which may occur, and particularly if it occurs towards the end of your processing. Now you process for 2 hours and you just have only about 15 minutes more of work to do, and things crashed. So the entire 2 hours work is all lost. So in order to avoid that, what you do is, maybe every half an hour you take a checkpoint. That means you are storing the entire state of the computer in some backup device like a hard disk, and then whenever an error occurs and the system stops, suppose it stops after 2 hours and 10 minutes, you have, if you took every half an hour, you have the map of the entire system at the end of 2 hours. So you don't have to run the 0 to 2 hours. You go back to what was the status at 2 hours and continue from there. So you only lost 10 minutes of computing. Okay, so that is a great thing. So checkpoint and restart is extremely important, particularly if you are running a long program from the point of view of failure. Also from the point of view of checking intermediate results in a very long and complex calculation. They can identify the region where the error occurred, because controls, essentially checkpoints, are the places where you have some check results, and you compare the check result with what it actually machine gave. There is an error, then you know that you probably have to go to the previous checkpoint and see, and that is the way you can roll back and recover. Auditing is another very important area in data processing. Auditing essentially means that there is an independent check of what you are really doing. So a method, an independent person comes and checks both your processes which you are using, and also whether any other carelessness which has happened, and whether you have put the proper controls and so on. and whether you have proper checkpoints, all those issues about controls, checkpoints, and record totals, batch totals, all those issues, the auditor reviews the entire process. And the auditor's job is to have an independent audit of your system and certify that your system is in reasonably secure state. That means normally frauds cannot take place, or frauds are even if they take place, it can be detected. Okay. So, auditor's job is both to prevent any frauds and also to trace any fraud which occurs and trace it and find out who is responsible for that. Okay. So, the objective of audit are ensure particularly computer based financial and other information is reliable. That is, we are doing a lot of financial data processing in the machine. If any kind of a financial irregularity occurs, that has got to be detected, and in fact prevention is much more than detection, but prevention is one of the aims of audit is to have methods of preventing and then later on detecting. Ensure that all records are included while the processing is being done. You don't, particularly for instance, if you have examination processing results, suppose 1,25,000 students took the exam, all 1,25,000 students results must be actually taken into account while processing and no record is missed. Ensure protection from fraud, of course. I mean, there is prevention of fraud. There are three methods which people talk about in this, and of course in this lectures I can give you enough flavor of auditing methods because there are books have been written on that. It's a very complex subject, and there are certified auditors who undergo a course and get a certification from an appropriate body. And certified auditors of information systems are in great demand because they go and look at particularly programs written in banks, insurance companies and so on, and certify that enough precautions have been taken to prevent fraud. So, the auditor's primary role, particularly certified auditor role, is to certify that appropriate precautions have been taken to prevent, and later on of course the auditor may be called up again if actually a fraud occurred to fix responsibility. One method is called auditing around the computer. So, in this case that means he does not actually work with the computer per se, you might say, but he takes sample inputs from that, manually applies the processing rules and compare the results. He may take randomly some records, do the processing which is called for, and then compare with the machine's results and see if they match. Okay. So, this is called, in other words, in the case of exam processing of students, he may take randomly on students' marks in various subjects, add that up and keep it as a control, and when the thing is run, he can again look at it and see. That is, he will go to the original document before data entry. So, he has the total from there, and after the data entry and after processing, then he will compare that against what he did manually with the original data he had access to. Okay. So, this ensures that no fraud has really taken place. If the people know that such an audit is being done, they will be a lot more careful, and they will not actually be careless in doing some fraud, because after all a person is always worried about being caught. Okay. There is another method called auditing through the computer. there is in the computer itself you establish audit trails which allow examining selected intermediate results. Like for instance, I talked about control totals, see, at random places. So the auditors may decide at what points the controls may have to be put, and he may not reveal it to anybody, and so he will have the controls with himself, and when the program is run he will compare his controls with the machine's results or intermediate results. So control totals provide intermediate checks. Facility to trace transaction values and print intermediate results. In other words, in between he may randomly get a point and do a printing of intermediate results of certain transactions, and he may decide that certain records have to be printed based on some criteria, only he knows that, like inactive accounts, overactive accounts, if you have a banking application, accounts with a very high balance, systems like that has to be checked, because very often inactive accounts are the ones which are targets of fraudsters, because they know that the person has not been dealing with the account, so he is not checking his accounts very carefully. So you can do a certain kind of fraud and then maybe even compensate. In other words, he may temporarily withdraw some money from an inactive account and reimburse it later on, particularly if he has got complete control over the data which is in a computer. Whereas if the auditor does at random points the inactive accounts and suddenly he finds some activity, then he can take, find out if that activity which actually took place is a legal activity by the actual person who has the bank account, or done by somebody as a fraud. Similarly, accounts with high balance are always targets of fraudsters. So these are all things which the auditor may decide. The high balance, the actual value of high or the value of inactive and so on, can always are set by the auditor, and they are secret to the auditor. It is not known to the person who are running the system. So that there is a little surprise factor. That is very essential to have prevention. And so the comparing credit and debit balances at random intervals, that will that will essentially will tell about the total credits, what is total debits, comparing them. And so logs are kept of who did what in critical data entry and to fix responsibility. That is, so they have to create an audit trail. That is, in the case, for instance, I talked about the land records where it's being manually done. So in fact, while the records are being entered, the person who enters the data, he puts his thumbprint at the beginning and at the end, and the auditor will check if there is an error. Thumbprint is a unique identification. Of course, the thumbprint readers are now available, and thumbprint comparisons also are very easy against a set of, because only a set of people will be authorized to enter data. So you only have to compare thumbprint against that 10 or 15 thumbprints. So that is much faster than random checking of any thumbprint. I mean, the police have a more difficult problem, because they have to check the thumbprint against a universe of criminals, which can be very large. Okay, whereas in this case, the set of people who handle data is a small set. So thumbprint and comparison will work fairly fast, and these are called biometric. Okay, so there is normally resorted to in many of the recent transactions, because it is just electronic. You don't have to use black ink and so on. You just put your thumb on that little reader, and then the machine scans the thumbprint and then stores it in the machine. Okay. So he can if there is any error occurred, he can find out who is an audit trail. He can find out who did it, and whether it is careless error or it is intentional error. Okay. And auditor himself puts some check inputs which are randomly created without the knowledge of the rest of the persons, and then he knows the expected outputs and sees what the machine does. So that to some extent it also checks if there are any programming errors, if it all occurred, that can be also checked by this. There is something called also auditing with the computer. Use a special audit package. There is a computer program you write called an audit package to check the system. Audit packages allow extracting data based on specified criterion for inspection. Suppose there are two students, there is a student with 80 marks in one subject and 18 marks in some other subject, then this program may throw out that to see whether correct data entries is made, because there is a possibility that if somebody got 80 somewhere, the probability of his getting 18 somewhere else is quite low. So such discrepancies, the audit package will actually do a filtering job of based on certain criteria, and that will also be specific to an application, and based on that the program is run on the machine and it actually brings out the appropriate records. Totaling specified subject of data for checking. Again, it is the subset is not known to anybody except the auditor. Procedure which says check sale discounts, process with independent data file created by the auditor and verify to see if the system is in as per specification. That is, he can actually look at the SRS and create something which is dummy data and see if the SRS given by the customer is met with by the actual system which is delivered. Okay. So this of course requires the auditor not only to be aware of computer procedures, programming and so on, but also about methodology which is to be kind of used to write audit programs and so on, and also the possible places where frauds and other things can occur. That is why I said that auditors are a certified set of people who have to undergo rigorous training, and they have to have knowledge of programming also, and that is a very currently a very fairly lucrative profession, because not many people are kind of getting into this profession. Testing is a very important part. In fact, there have been companies set up whose only job is a third party testing of programs developed by some companies. The reason they want to have third party testing is that the person who develops a program has a certain kind of a mindset, and he may not easily find errors in it. Whereas a person who is independent, an external agent, he is not biased. He will probably do a job of testing which is reasonably thorough. Because nowadays, of course, even in companies, they have teams of programmers. There are two, in fact, there is something called extreme programming, where there are two programmers who do the same thing, and then each one does a so-called code walkthrough the other. As you write a piece of program, and somebody else goes through that program and checks it. He writes a piece of program, you go through it and check it. Then the two are put together to make the full program. So in other words, almost manual checking is being done by two independent people, and this is kind of a code walkthrough which is routinely used by many companies to detect errors or testing the program. Apart from that, the code walkthrough has also got another important application, namely understandability of the code. Understandability of code is very important for maintenance purposes. And so the code, if somebody else walks through your code and is able to understand it, that is, if he's not able to understand it, then of course you say it's a bad code. You ask the person to rewrite the code. If he's able to understand it, then it's a reasonable code and you can test it independently. So there are two types of testing. At the program level, you can test the program, but then the system consists of many programs. So one has to worry about the entire system. So this system testing, the objective is to ensure that the entire system will perform as per specification, because system contains lots of modules. Each module may have multiple programs, and so system testing is very important. And make sure that system meets users' requirements. Again, as I said, the most important thing in any commercial data processing is to meet users' requirements, and because he is the person who is going to pay you. Okay, so testing, one of the objectives is to make sure of that. Whenever control functions, controls are put properly and they function as they are intended. System testing is to make sure also that incorrect inputs, incorrect processing and incorrect outputs, if any, are detected during operation. Okay, in other words, we put a lot of batch controls, we put audit trails and so on, but system testing, again, at the time of testing, before it is delivery to the customer, you make sure that proper precautions have been taken for detecting incorrect inputs, incorrect processing rules, as well as incorrect programs which will lead to incorrect outputs. So include both computer based and manual process. In other words, not everything is completely now system testing, as I said, code walkthrough is a manual process. So one person writes the code, somebody else is manually checking it. Okay, so both manual and automatic process are used. Remember, the system testing is done before the system is released and ready for operation, because once the system starts operation, then you really cannot touch it as far as possible, because once the system is delivered and you start meddling with it, the customer loses complete confidence in you. Secondly, any errors which show up at operational time are very expensive. That takes a lot of effort to correct. It also may lead to heavy financial losses of the customer. So it is a duty of the systems people who deliver, the company which delivers the software, to make sure that thorough testing is done in all kinds of situations before it is released to the customer, so the customer doesn't get into any kind of a problem. System tests can be classified as program tests. Well, program tests, code walkthrough is one method, and test data is another. Test data, you create some test data and test the program with test data, and that testing is done by a third party. That is not by the person who created the program, but test data is created by somebody else, and he also runs the program on that test data to see if the answers are as expected. In fact, many of these companies which specialize in testing essentially have methods, their unique quality or selling point, you might say, is that they are able to do a reasonably thorough testing by creating necessary and sufficient data to kind of more or less give you a certification that the system is working correctly. Normally individual modules are tested and integration test is also done. That is, module test is not sufficient, because when you interconnect, there are boundaries you got to check, and within the program, of course, you do in programs loop checks, loop counts, loop invariants are all methods that are actually used for in programs. Okay. Results from a program fed as input to a succeeding program, in other words, because many programs go together and become a system, you have to see whether the proper inputs are being given to the next program. A string of programs run one after the other to see if all of them properly synchronize and give the expected result. All programs in a complete system are tested together as a whole, tested using reasonable data and unreasonable data both, and non-key data besides normal test data for the whole system. In other words, you give something which is unexpected, okay, and then see if the system still kind of brings out a data entry error or system behaves as expected. If something unusual data is put in, system should reject it. The system does not reject it, but uses it for processing, then obviously there is something very seriously wrong with the system. So, these are the things which system tests are supposed to bring out. And there are pilot tests. When the system is actually delivered to customer, you have a pilot run. In other words, before it actually goes into what is called a production run, that is use it daily, day to day for its operations, you have pilot tests. In other words, you run a manual system or say the earlier system which is actually existing, and you also run the new system. And whatever the earlier system did, because the earlier system was operational for a long period of time, hopefully most of the errors have been removed. So, you check the new system and see if the earlier system's results and the new system's results match for the same conditions, of course. New system very often may add functionality, but the old function will still be there. So, actually check the old functions first, and of course, the new functionality is checked separately. And the pilot run, during that run, what the new functionality gives to the customer is also evident to the customer. Okay. So, for the modification of the earlier computer system, use data input and output from the old system. That is what I have been saying. Parallel runs, in other words, run both manual and computer based systems. There is a manual system already going on, you run the manual system and the computer based system till you kind of reject the manual system, that is, you retire the manual system and tally to the computer based system. For instance, a hotel, a small hotel may be currently having complete manual system. You go there and make a computer based system for them, they may still run the manual system for some time while the computer based system is also running in parallel. And when any arrays come out of the computer based system as compared to what is going on in manual system, then you know that there are, you can actually even trace where the error occurred. So, this pilot runs are very important, parallel runs for both the manual and this. And similarly, for if there is an existing program, you run both of them. For a re-engineered system, run both old and the new and compare the results. Now, one more topic is about security. We talked about control, we talked about audit, we talked about testing. Now, the another very important part of any information system is security. Security means protection of data from accidental or intentional modification, destruction or disclosure to unauthorized persons. In fact, this is a major concern of many of our business process outsourcing outfits. Recently, there was a case where a person who was working in a bank disclosed the credit card numbers of a number of customers to fraudsters in a different country, and the fraudsters use those credit card numbers to defraud the customers and take out money or purchase items from their from using their credit cards. In fact, the fraud was not detected till about almost £500,000 were lost, and customers complained about transactions they never made. So that means the system which has been in place is not secure. By allowing certain people whom you cannot trust with data which is too valuable. In fact, you suppose credit card data and stuff like that, and they are stored in a database, it should be encrypted. It should not be just available for everybody to download and look at the number. It has got to be encrypted. Proper security measure is to kind of encrypt it, in other words garble it in some way, and then the decryption key is known only to a supervisor, and so the processing is done, storage is done with encrypted data, processing is done with unencrypted data but with the key given by the supervisor, and then before it is stored back again, it is again encrypted, and in between the access is extremely restricted, because processing part not many people are deal with, but data many people deal with. In fact, data entry operators deal with the original data. Okay, and of course you got to be extremely careful at data entry stage, because I said that you have to make sure that the data entry operator does not know what is what in a particular record, so that he cannot essentially use it for any fraudulent purposes. Security means protection of data from accidental or intentional modification, destruction or disclosure. Okay. There are certain threats to security. Natural disasters. In other words, the last year there was a huge rain in Bombay, and certain bank computers are all affected, and so the data which has got to be secure were almost lost unless they took some precautions to do for that. Disaster can be like floods, Bombay floods. This year again there is a lot of rain and they are afraid there may again be flooding and so on. And we had things like tsunami which created havoc in many of the coastal areas, and earthquakes which can destroy buildings, or terrorism like the 9/11 terrorism, where many banks were destroyed in that when the World Trade Center was effectively destroyed. So one has to make sure that the data, which is an important resource for many companies, is actually not easily tamperable, and also that it is protected. In case there is some problem like a disaster, you can recover the data and restart your work. Okay. So similarly, accidents can occur like disk crashes, fire erasures, and inexperienced operators and so on. Okay. So you have to guard against accidents. Theft, to evasion of data by disgruntled employees, because again these are to be guarded against. So these threats are so called security threats. Frauds by changing programs or data of employees, industrial espionage, somebody from outside wants to get hold of your valuable data, like it may be a competitor's sales strategy, and in fact even companies guard very jealously what they sold where. Okay, and that information again, as people are try to kind of steal that to kind of have a proper competition, because viruses and worms are ever present in particularly in networks where they are generated by vandals and set on the internet. Hackers who break into system connected to the internet and try to steal data or kind of spoil data. Denial of service attacks by flooding with mail. In other words, suppose you have a website and legitimate users want to get hold of the website, but you create a dummy or domain program. With every 2 seconds it goes and kind of sends an inquiry to your website. For all practical purposes, your website will be unapproachable or inaccessible to legitimate customers. Legitimate customers just keeping that very busy, like your phone. Somebody who can go on giving you nonsense calls can keep your phone busy and not let others use your phone. So this kind of a denial of service attacks. So these are all you have to guard against. So to guard against things like disasters and so on, you have to take a backup of all your data regularly. In other words, normally what is done in banks is at the end of every day they take what they call an incremental backup. That is, whatever changed during the day from the database which is present at the beginning of the day, all the changes are stored, and this change data, if they are stored, then every week they will take a complete backup of all the data, so that at the most you will leave 1 week's data, because every day you are essentially taking up incremental thing. So if it is 7 days incremental changes and use the data which you stored 7 days ago, you can recreate everything. And if it is very important data, you may backup instead of incremental backup, you may do entire backup, but entire backup is very expensive in terms of storage space. Okay, so you do normally incremental backup, and backup copies are kept in a different place. In other words, if you are doing a weekly backup, for instance, the disk, all the disk data, then you put in tapes or CDs depending on situation. If it is a huge amount of data, people normally put it on tapes, and those tapes are stored in a different location completely. Now, if your bank, for instance, is situated in say some suburb of Bombay, you will put it possibly in another suburb of Bombay, or even in a place like Pune, which is about 100 miles away, 150 miles away, so that the probability of disaster in a place which is 200 miles away is much lower. So you can still recover the data that way. Okay, and you take an incremental backup. As I said, and backup copies are kept a safe and remote place for recovery. And of course, encrypting, as I said, sensitive data has been encrypted and stored, and identifying all persons who read that modified data, particularly for critical data, thumbprint is essential. Otherwise, you have some method of trailing the person who logged in, logged out. Many companies even have a video camera which captures the person who had access and who did this. Okay. And so there are primarily many methods of doing this, and because I am almost coming to the end of this module, but I do not have time to cover the entire module. So I think I will take the rest of it next time and revise a little bit of the previous part, like maybe I will start at this point and then complete this particular module. Okay, thank you.